It is astonishing that Soviet soldiers in their daily lives would resort to drinking tank antifreeze, concocting their own industrial alcohol mixtures, and even extracting alcohol from unlikely sources like shoe polish and toothpaste, all in pursuit of a drink. From the establishment to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the military struggled to eradicate these practices, but they persisted stubbornly. This program will explore the drinking culture within the Soviet Army. Due to Russia's cold climate and unique cultural history, Russians have a widespread fondness for alcohol, particularly high-proof spirits like vodka. By the mid-19th century, revenues from state-controlled vodka sales made up over 40% of the government's income, and approximately one-third of Russian men were indebted to state-run taverns. Following the outbreak of World War I, Tsar Nicholas II imposed a prohibition on the sale of vodka and other spirits, except in privileged establishments. The government believed this measure would enhance productivity, maintain social order, and aid in recruiting new soldiers. After the October Revolution, the nascent Soviet regime regarded alcoholism as a societal ill, and Lenin upheld the prohibition. It was not until Stalin came to power that the ban was lifted, reinstating the state's monopoly on vodka to bolster government revenues while imposing strict regulations on the military. The People's Commissariat for Defense issued decrees strictly prohibiting alcoholism in the Red Army, with severe penalties including expulsion from the military or trial for particularly egregious offenders. This decree may have been effective during peacetime. However, wartime presented a different scenario. For instance, during the Winter War of 1939, Soviet troops camping in the open were easy targets for Finnish forces. Without fires for cooking, soldiers lacked hot meals, making it difficult to maintain basic warmth, let alone combat readiness. Additionally, they faced temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius, heavy snowfall, and agile Finnish ski troops and snipers, which pushed the soldiers' mental endurance to the limit, making strong liquor essential for stress relief. Even the most radical and loyal Bolsheviks had to acknowledge the importance of alcohol for the troops. Consequently, the Soviet Army adopted the traditional Russian method of distributing vodka to the troops. In January 1940, Defense Commissar Voroshilov proposed daily rations of 100 grams of vodka and 50 grams of lard for soldiers and officers to help them endure the harsh winter. Tank crews and other technical personnel received double the amount, while pilots were typically supplied with brandy. After the Winter War, the distribution of alcohol ceased, but with the onset of the German-Soviet War, the practice was reinstated. On August 22, 1941, the State Defense Committee issued Decree No. 562, mandating that frontline soldiers receive 100 grams of 40% alcohol vodka daily. Unlike during the Winter War, the purpose this time was to help soldiers cope with the early defeats and low morale of the German-Soviet War, alleviating the immense pressure they faced on the battlefield. Additionally, high-alcohol beverages metabolize quickly in the body, converting to energy to replenish depletion. In combat, vodka became a source of motivation for soldiers, many of whom would charge recklessly into battle, only to be quickly revived by a sip of alcohol, more effective than a worker's coffee. Thus, vodka became an indispensable strategic resource for the Soviet Army. During the Battle of Stalingrad, Lieutenant Fyodor Ilchenko remarked, "Without alcohol, we couldn't have withstood the cold." On the front lines, a bottle of alcohol was more precious than ammunition. Alcoholic beverages not only warmed the soldiers' bodies, but also prevented frostbite on many nights spent in the open. However, vodka was not without its harms. While it boosted soldiers' morale, it also caused significant damage to the army. Just as today, Russia sees over 40,000 people freeze to death annually due to intoxication, many Soviet soldiers suffered severe alcohol abuse, passing out and freezing to death, resulting in numerous non-combat casualties. Some alcohol addicts craving for drink far exceeded their fear of war. They would sneak into German trenches to trade anything they had for alcohol. Not only soldiers, but also many officers were heavy drinkers. Commander Alexei Zhigin of the 39th Army Group often drank with his men, once consuming a month's worth of alcohol rations. Subsequently, in a drunken state, he ordered a battalion to blindly charge German positions, leading to a failed operation and heavy casualties. As soldiers' demand for alcohol became increasingly uncontrollable, Soviet High Command had to take action. From May 1942, the military stipulated that only soldiers in units that had distinguished themselves in combat could receive alcohol, with their ration increased to 200 grams, while other frontline soldiers could only drink on holidays. In 1943, Stalin signed an order strictly limiting vodka distribution and initiating a crackdown within the Soviet Army. Soldiers caught engaging in alcohol-related misconduct faced severe punishment. However, due to the widespread nature of alcohol abuse, the government could not effectively control it and eventually chose not to distribute vodka, allowing soldiers to brew their own. At that time, nearly every Soviet soldier had their own brewing equipment, and each division had its own brewing workshop, all aimed at circumventing superior officers' drinking regulations to obtain extra alcohol. Thus, self-supplying alcohol became almost a standard skill among Soviet troops. In addition to homemade alcohol, soldiers would seek other drinkable liquids on the battlefield. For example, mixing aircraft or tank antifreeze with juice could produce a decent-tasting drink. Drinking antifreeze directly was not out of the question. There were cases of Soviet tank crews going blind from drinking large amounts of alcohol-containing tank antifreeze. The Soviet Army could also capture alcoholic beverages from the Germans. Although these had lower alcohol content than vodka, they were still a viable option. When alcohol was unavailable, the Soviet Army would mix various ethanols. During their retreat, the Germans left behind large quantities of industrial alcohol containing methanol in reserve, labeled as alcoholic beverages, in an attempt to lure Soviet soldiers into drinking them, a particularly insidious tactic. As expected, thousands of Soviet soldiers unknowingly drank these, resulting in poisoning. Overall, alcohol did boost the Soviet Army's morale during the war, but also brought numerous problems, especially regarding military discipline. Despite multiple attempts by the Soviet Army to address this, the effects were minimal. The Soviet Union could not simply ban alcohol outright, because the army still needed soldiers to fight bravely on the battlefield. It was not until the end of the war that the Soviet Army officially issued a prohibition order, strictly forbidding soldiers from drinking. Was this method effective? One can only say that traditional forces are powerful, and making Soviet soldiers completely abstain from alcohol was nearly impossible. By the Cold War era, Soviet soldiers were still notorious for their alcohol consumption, going to great lengths to find a drink. For example, ground crews for the MiG-25 fighter jet were considered to have a cushy job because the aircraft's nose housed radar and generators that required over 200 liters of a water-methanol mixture for cooling. Although theoretically undrinkable, when alcohol craving struck, they often disregarded this, mixing water and methanol to make a drink. Soldiers' experience was to drink only 1 cup a day to avoid alcohol-induced blindness. During the Afghan War, soldiers would even spread shoe polish on bread, bake it until the surface crisped, scrape off the polish, and enjoy the alcohol-infused bread. The Soviet Army could also purchase various alcohols from Afghan merchants, ranging from brandy from the claimed distillery to inferior spirits from backstreet stills. Concerned about soldiers poisoning themselves from drinking, the Soviet military repeatedly warned them against such practices. In that high-pressure war, which was not officially acknowledged in its early stages, banning soldiers from drinking was clearly unwise. Therefore, the military did not directly prohibit these transactions, but instead set up military police patrols to prevent off-duty soldiers from hoarding alcohol. However, their method of prevention was not sophisticated. They simply taxed the victims. As a result, the alcohol ended up in the hands of the patrol teams, and everyone took turns serving as patrollers, rendering the prohibition effectively meaningless. As one soldier recalled, it was the only time in his military career that he did not mind wearing the red armband of a patroller. To this day, the Russian military has not completely eradicated the phenomena of soldiers' alcohol abuse and drinking antifreeze. On some military equipment, one can often see labels that seem absurd to outsiders. For example, during an exercise of the Western Military District's Air Defense Forces, the windshield of an S-400 air defense missile vehicle bore a sticker in Russian that translated to "Antifreeze is toxic." The sole purpose of these warning labels is to remind Russian soldiers not to succumb to a momentary craving and drink the vehicle's antifreeze. It seems that the Russians are unrivaled in their love for alcohol. This concludes today's program. We look forward to meeting you again.